Everyone told him she was nothing. A rogue wolf. A girl dragged out of the mud with broken bones and no pack and no name worth remembering. They were wrong. And the moment he realized it, the moment the lights went out in his great hall and she was the only thing still glowing, everything he thought he knew about power collapsed like ash. He had broken her wrist. She did not scream. He had commanded her to submit. She said no. And then she did something that 300 years of history had been specifically designed to prevent her from doing. She stood up. Here is what nobody is telling you about this story. She was not the victim. She was never the victim. She was the weapon the world buried because it was not ready for her. And she came back from 3 centuries in the dark, not angry, not broken, not begging for survival. She came back with the dark inside her, like a lantern. And the most powerful king in the Northern Reach, undefeated, unmovable, the kind of man that legends build themselves around without asking permission, took one look at what she actually was and got on his knee. In the mud of his own hall. In front of his entire court. But that is not even the twist. The twist is what was following her through the Thornwood. The twist is what his own bloodline buried 300 years ago and never told him about. The twist is the thing that his ancestors were so afraid of that they pressed 9 living wolves into the roots of a consecrated forest rather than face it. And it woke up before she did. And it was already inside his walls before anyone knew her name. If you have ever felt like the world put you underground because it was terrified of what you would become. If you have ever watched someone mistake your silence for weakness and realized, quietly, that you were going to let them. If you have ever been the last of something and carried that weight alone in the dark for longer than anyone should have to. This story was written for you. Do not skip this. You will not find another ending like this one anywhere this year. She did not save him with strength. She did not save him with rage. She saved him the way the sun saves the morning, by simply finally becoming what she had always been. And he had the extraordinary privilege of being the one standing beside her when she did. Stay for the ending. It will leave you in pieces. The good kind. The kind that puts you back together slightly different than you were before. The bones in her wrists snapped like dry kindling. She did not scream. That was the first thing Selim noticed. Not the blood threading through the freezing mud beneath her knees, not the way her body trembled like a struck bell, but the silence where her pain should have lived. Every wolf in his court had screamed when he broke them. Every single one. The great hall of Ashenvale reeked of pine sap and old iron, the torches guttering against stone walls that had absorbed 300 years of submission. He stood over her the way mountains stand over rivers, immovable, inevitable, carved from something older than mercy. Say it, he commanded. His voice was the thing legends were built on. It moved through the air like thunder through a valley, pressing against the chests of every wolf present until their lungs forgot how to function. She raised her eyes. They were the color of a sky 30 seconds before lightning decides where to land. No, she said. The word was quiet. It was so quiet that Selim almost did not believe his own ears had received it. Behind him, his beta exhaled sharply, a sound like a man watching someone step off a cliff without looking down. Lyra Voss had been dragged into Ashenvale 3 hours ago. Her boots caked in the black mud of the Thornwood. Her dark hair matted with pine needles and the dried evidence of a chase that had lasted 2 full days. She was 17. She was rogue. She was nothing. This was what every wolf in his court understood, what the laws of their kind had dictated for centuries. A rogue without a pack was a wound that had not yet found the decency to close. Selim crouched down until his face was level with hers. He could smell the cold on her skin, the mineral bite of river water, the strange and impossible scent beneath it all. Something ancient, like stone ground to dust beneath a glacier moving 1 inch per decade. He had never smelled anything like it on a living creature. You are standing at the edge of something you do not understand, he told her. His golden eyes did not blink. Submit or break. Those are the only two things that exist in this room tonight. She looked at him the way stars look at everything, from an incomprehensible distance, without fear, without the need for his permission to exist. You have been saying that to people for so long, she said softly, that you have forgotten there is a third option. The torches went out. Every single one. Simultaneously. Not guttered, not flickered, gone, as though light itself had received an instruction and obeyed. The darkness that replaced them was not merely the absence of fire. It was textured. It pressed against skin like cold velvet. It had weight, the way grief has weight, the way the moment before sentence is handed down has weight. Several wolves in his court made sounds that Selim would never allow them to admit to afterward. He did not move. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, sovereign of 11 packs, undefeated in 43 challenges, and he did not flinch in the dark. But his blood had gone very, very still. Because he could still see her. In the absolute and total absence of every light source in the hall, in darkness that should have been absolute, Lyra Voss was faintly, impossibly luminous. Not glowing. That was the wrong word. She was the thing that existed just before glow. She was the source. What? He said, and it was not a question, it was the sound a foundation makes when something vast shifts beneath it. Are you? She turned her broken wrist over slowly in her lap. In the pale light that seemed to breathe from her skin, he watched the bones move beneath the surface, and then stop and then knit. The sound of her own skeleton reassembling was soft and patient, like ice cracking in reverse. I am what your kind buried, she said. 300 years ago. In the Thornwood. Under the roots of the oldest tree you could find. Because you were afraid of what we might become. The darkness breathed. Selim felt it against the back of his neck like a second presence. Not threatening, which somehow made it more threatening. Celestial wolves, he said. He heard his own voice say it the way a man hears himself say the name of something he was told as a child was a myth meant to frighten the powerful into humility. You do not exist. You keep using that sentence, she said, as though I have agreed to be bound by it. She stood. She stood with her newly healed wrist held loosely at her side, and she rose to her full height, which was not impressive, which was in fact unremarkable, which somehow made the moment more catastrophic. And the darkness rose with her the way a tide rises with the moon. Because that was what she was. That was the secret his ancestors had buried and burned the records of and told their children was legend. The celestial wolves did not draw power from the pack bond. They did not shift under the full moon like animals answering a call they could not refuse. They were the call. They were the thing the moon answered to. And standing in his hall, in the ruins of his torchlight, in the wreckage of every assumption he had built his reign upon, Selim felt something happen in his chest that 43 victorious challenges had never once provoked. He felt the specific and annihilating terror of realizing that the thing he had broken his thumb against was not an obstacle. It was a door. And it had been waiting, patient as glaciers, quiet as the space between stars, for someone to finally press hard enough. I did not come here to fight you, Lyra said. Her voice in the dark was the sound of the universe stating a fact it had no emotional investment in. I came here because something is coming through the Thornwood. Something that was buried the same night I was. Something that is not like me. She looked at him, and for the first time since the lights died, he saw the thing living behind her impossible eyes. Not power, not pride, not the calm of someone who knows they cannot be broken. Fear. Genuine structural fear. The kind that lives in the body of a creature who knows exactly what a threat is capable of because she was the only one present who survived the last time it was awake. Selim held her gaze for a long time. The torches reignited on their own, gentle, almost apologetic, as though light understood it was returning to a room that was not quite the same room it had left. He straightened to his full height. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. He had ruled by force and law and the absolute gravity of his own will. He had never, not once, taken a knee. He did it slowly. One knee in the iron-cold mud of his own hall floor, the smell of old stone and torch smoke filling his lungs, the sound of every wolf present ceasing to breathe. "Tell me what is coming," he said. And the girl who had been buried 300 years ago and survived it looked down at the king of everything and began to explain what the dark had kept alive all this time. The Alpha King raised his crown. She lowered the stars. Part 2: What the Dark Keeps. She did not sit when he offered her the chair. That was the second thing Selim noticed about her. The first being her silence in pain, the second being her refusal of comfort even when comfort was extended without condition. She stood beside the great stone hearth at the far end of the hall, the fire there burning with a particular desperation of flames that had recently been reminded of their own fragility. Her hands were at her sides. Her wrist, the one he had broken, showed no evidence that anything had ever happened to it. The skin was smooth and unmarked and faintly, almost imperceptibly luminous, like the inside of a shell held up to a window on a gray morning. The court wolves had been dismissed. Selim had not asked them to leave so much as looked at his beta, Drav, who had the good sense and the long experience to clear the hall in under 40 seconds, guiding bodies through the heavy iron doors with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that history was being made and wanted no witnesses who might complicate the telling of it later. Now it was just the three of them, Selim, Lyra and Drav, who stood near the door with his arms folded and his expression arranged into the careful blankness of someone who was, internally, experiencing something close to a spiritual crisis. Selim had risen from his knee. He would not do it again. He needed to be clear with himself about that. The gesture had been necessary, instinctive in the way that the body sometimes understands protocol before the mind has caught up, but it would not become a pattern. He was still the Alpha King. She was still a rogue wolf who had appeared in his territory uninvited, carrying secrets that his bloodline had worked very hard to make certain no one would ever have to deal with again. He pulled a chair from the long council table and sat in it backwards, his arms folded across the top of the backrest, watching her. "Speak," he said. He meant it without cruelty this time. He meant it the way commanders mean it when the information has become more important than the power dynamic. Lyra turned from the fire. The flames behind her moved the shadows across her face in patterns that made her look older. Not aged, but deep, the way ancient things look deep, the way you look into a well and understand that the darkness at the bottom is not emptiness but distance. "There were 9 of us," she said. 9 celestial wolves, the last of a bloodline that your ancestors spent 2 generations trying to eliminate. They did not succeed with violence. Violence did not work on us the way it works on your kind. So they tried something older than violence. He paused. Not for effect. She paused the way people pause when they are deciding whether to say the next thing out loud, because saying things out loud gives them a specific and irrevocable weight. "They used the earth," she said. "The Thornwood is not simply a forest. It was consecrated 3 centuries ago by a wolf shaman whose name has been removed from every record your archivists keep. The trees there are not growing. They are holding. Their roots were wound around each of us the way a hand winds around a throat. Not to kill, because killing us had already proved impossible, but to suspend. To press pause on what we were in the middle of becoming." Selim kept his face still. He was very good at keeping his face still. It was one of the first disciplines of leadership, to receive information without letting your body tell the room how that information is landing. But something moved behind his eyes, and Lyra saw it, and he knew she saw it, and neither of them addressed it. "What were you becoming?" Drav asked from the doorway. His voice was careful. He was a careful man, Drav. Built like a siege weapon but precise in all his movements, the kind of wolf who measured twice and never needed to cut at all. Lyra looked at him. Something your records describe as the second convergence, she said. Drav made a sound. It was a very small sound. It was the sound of a man who had read those records, who had spent considerable time being grateful that the second convergence was theoretical, and who was now rapidly rearranging his understanding of his own situation. That is a myth, he said. You are going to want to stop saying that to me, Lyra replied, and there was no heat in it, no irritation, just the flat and patient tone of someone who has had a very long time to become accustomed to being called impossible. Selim stood. He moved to the window, a long narrow gap in the stone, arrow-slit wide, that looked out over the Ashenvale courtyard and beyond it, to the dark tree line where the Thornwood began its crooked and lightless reach toward the horizon. He could see it from here, even in the dead of night. The Thornwood had its own quality of darkness, denser than the sky above it, heavier than the fields surrounding it, a darkness that did not simply absorb light but seemed to actively discourage it. He had grown up looking at that tree line. He had grown up being told to stay out of the Thornwood, and unlike most children who are told to stay out of things, he had obeyed, because even as a child, before his power had consolidated into the thing it had become, some animal part of him had understood that the Thornwood's darkness was not natural. It was a lock. What is coming through? He asked. His breath fogged faintly against the cold stone of the window frame. The 10th, she said. He turned. There were only 9 of you, Drav said. There were 9 celestial wolves, Lyra said. The 10th is not a wolf. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard, a sentry wolf shifted his weight on the frozen ground, and the ice beneath his boots gave a small and isolated crack that carried all the way to the window where Selim stood. Then what is it? Selim asked. Lyra's jaw tightened. It was the first physical expression of difficulty she had displayed, the first sign that there was something her extraordinary composure was working against. It is the reason we were becoming what we were becoming, she said. The celestial wolves did not develop our abilities in isolation. We were responding to something. The way a body develops antibodies in response to a disease. We were the immune system. The second convergence was not a power we were reaching for. It was a threshold we were being pushed toward by the presence of something that required that level of response. Silence settled over the hall like snow settling over a field. Gradually, completely, softening every edge. And you are telling me, Selim said slowly, that whatever it is, it has been suspended in the Thornwood alongside you. And it is no longer suspended. I felt it wake 3 days before I freed myself, she said. It woke first. Whatever the shaman used to bind us, the 10th thing was stronger, or the binding was weaker, or 300 years was simply the limit of what the consecration could hold. She crossed her arms over her chest. Not defensively, but the way people cross their arms when they are cold and trying not to show it. I do not know what it calls itself, she said. I know what it did to the world the last time it was free. I know what 8 of us died trying to stop it. And I know that I am the only one who survived the binding and managed to wake, which means I am the only one left. Selim heard the shape of what she was not saying. She was the only one left, and she had come here. To him, to the hall of the Alpha King, to the descendants of the wolves who had buried her. Because being the only one left meant she could not do this alone, and she had nowhere else to go. She had walked into the den of the people who had imprisoned her and knelt in their mud, and endured the breaking of her bones because the thing coming through the Thornwood was worse than any of this. That required a specific quality of desperation. Or a specific quality of courage. He was not yet certain which it was. He was becoming uncertain that there was a meaningful difference. I will need to see the Thornwood, he said. In the morning, Lyra said. Not before. The dark out there is not regular dark right now. Going near the tree line before sunrise is not something I would recommend even to you. Selim felt the slight in the qualifier, even to you, and chose to receive it as the strategic assessment it probably was rather than the challenge it might have been. You will be given a room, he said. A guarded room, Drav added from the doorway, because Drav was nothing if not thorough. Lyra looked at him. The guards are for my protection or yours? She asked. Drav considered the question with genuine seriousness. At this point, he said, I am not certain the distinction is particularly meaningful. Something happened at the corner of Lyra's mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the structural suggestion of a smile, the way a scar suggests the original wound. Selim filed it away without examining why. He showed her to the corridor himself, which was not something Alpha Kings typically did, which meant every wolf they passed in the stone hallways of Ashenvale registered it with wide eyes and carefully neutral expressions and would absolutely be discussing it in whispered clusters before the hour was out. He did not particularly care. He cared about the Thornwood and what was walking toward them through its roots, and he cared about the girl beside him who smelled like glaciers and old stone and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the last of something, and he cared about the fact that his court was full of people and none of those people had any idea what the next sunrise might require of them. He stopped at the door of the east wing guest chamber, stone-walled, heavy-doored, with a window that faced away from the Thornwood, which suddenly seemed like an important architectural feature. If you need anything in the night, he said. I will not, she said. He believed her, which was itself an interesting and somewhat uncomfortable development. He left her there. He walked back through the corridors of Ashenvale with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression arranged into the particular configuration that his court knew meant do not speak to me unless the building is on fire, and he went to his study, and he sat at his desk, and he pulled out the oldest archive his family kept. The one with the black cover, the one he had been told upon assuming the throne at 19, contained information that was academic and historical, and would never be relevant to an actively reigning king because the things described within it were the kind of things that happened once every several centuries at most. He opened it to the section on the second convergence. He read for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the girl sleeping. Or not sleeping. He genuinely could not imagine her sleeping, could not map the concept of unconsciousness onto her face, in the East Wing guest chamber. He thought about what the archive said the second convergence was. He thought about what the archive said the 10th thing was. And then he thought about the fact that every intelligence network he maintained, every informant embedded in the courts of rival packs, every wolf he had stationed at border crossings and river passes and the 12 roads that led in and out of Northern Reach territory. Not one of them had reported a rogue wolf moving through the Thornwood. Not one of them had reported anything moving through the Thornwood, which meant either his network had failed catastrophically and simultaneously, which was not impossible but was deeply unlikely, or someone had known she was coming before she arrived, and had made certain he would not receive advance warning. He was still sitting with that thought, still turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath it, when Drav knocked and entered without waiting, which was the agreed protocol for information that could not afford the 10 seconds of knocking courtesy. Drav's face was the careful blankness of a man who had looked at something very bad and was now professionally managing his reaction to it. We have a problem, Drav said. Selim looked at him. Lord Soren's delegation, Drav said. They arrived an hour ago. 3 hours early. They are in the South Reception Hall. Selim felt something in his chest go cold and deliberate, the way a river goes cold in autumn, not suddenly, but with a thoroughness that left no part of it untouched. Lord Soren of the Eastern Reach was not his enemy in the way that enemies announced themselves. He was his enemy in the way that weather is an enemy, pervasive, structural, operating through systems rather than direct action, almost impossible to confront directly because the moment you tried, it had already moved somewhere else. He was also, Selim now understood with a clarity that arrived the way all important understandings arrived, slowly and then completely, the most likely architect of his missing advance warning. Soren had people inside his network. That was not new information. What was new was the timing of this visit. 3 hours early, 1 hour after Lyra Voss had been brought through the front gates of Ashenvale in chains. They saw her, Selim said. It was not a question. Drav's jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. The gate wolves confirm that Soren's lead outrider was present in the courtyard when she was brought in. He would have seen her face. He would have seen the light, Selim said. Because even in the torchlit courtyard, even in the organized chaos of a rogue wolf being processed through his gates, Lyra Voss had that quality about her. That pre-luminous depth, that suggestion of something vast living just beneath the surface of her skin. Anyone who knew what to look for would have seen it. And Soren, whose family had maintained their own private archive for 3 centuries, would absolutely know what to look for. Selim stood. He was already calculating, mapping exits, resources, the relative positions of Soren's delegation in the South Reception Hall versus the East Wing guest chamber, the number of wolves he trusted completely versus the number he trusted contingently versus the number he was now, with fresh and urgent eyes, re-evaluating. How many in the delegation? He asked. 12, Drav said. 7 of whom I recognize as Soren's first-tier guard. The kind he brings when he is not planning to negotiate. The kind he brings when he is planning to take something, Selim said. Drav said nothing. He did not need to say anything. They had known each other for 15 years, and 15 years of shared context meant that the silences between them were often the most efficient form of communication available. Wake the East Wing, Selim said. Quietly. Move her to the lower chambers. The ones that do not appear on the guest map Soren's people will have access to. Post 4 wolves at the corridor entrance, but do it in plain clothes, and do not make it look like guarding. And Soren? Drav asked. Selim straightened his jacket. He rolled his shoulders once, slowly, the way a wolf settles his weight before something that will require everything he has. I will go and be hospitable, he said. The South Reception Hall was Ashenvale's most performative room. High ceilings crossed with carved stone beams, walls hung with the territorial banners of every pack that had, at one point or another, bent the knee to the Northern Reach. It was a room designed to make visitors feel the specific weight of Selim's history before he had said a single word. Lord Soren had apparently decided to feel nothing of the sort. He was standing at the center of the room with the posture of a man examining property he had already mentally purchased. His pale hands clasped behind his back. His delegation arranged around him with the practiced casualness of people who were not being casual at all. He was 43 years old and looked it in the way that certain kinds of power look their age. Not diminished by time but clarified by it, sharpened into something more precise and therefore more dangerous than whatever he had been in his youth. His eyes were gray. The particular gray of water just before it freezes. Selim, he said, as though they were contemporaries, as though the 12 years between their ages and the vast differential in their territorial holdings were conversational niceties that could simply be set aside. Soren, Selim replied, as though he had been expecting this visit, as though 3 hours early was a scheduling preference he was aware of and comfortable with. He did not offer his hand. Soren did not offer his. They stood 8 feet apart in the center of the South Reception Hall, and performed the ancient and exhausting ritual of 2 powerful men pretending not to be assessing each other's weaknesses. I hope the road from the eastern reach was kind, Selim said. It was efficient, Soren said. We made excellent time. I hope our early arrival has not caused inconvenience. None whatsoever, Selim said. The lie was mutual and they both knew it and neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledgement would have disrupted the performance, and the performance was, for now, the safest place to conduct this conversation. I heard you had some excitement at the gates this evening, Soren said. His tone was mild. His tone was so mild that it required genuine effort to remember that the information contained within that mildness was a declaration of surveillance. He was telling Selim, in the language of powerful men speaking to each other in performative settings, that he had eyes inside Ashenvale and was comfortable enough in his position to let Selim know it. A rogue wolf from the Thornwood border, Selim said. Not unusual for the season. The cold drives them in. From the Thornwood specifically, Soren said. That is a little unusual, I would think. The Thornwood is not the sort of place that produces rogue wolves through ordinary means. Selim looked at him. He did not change his expression. He simply looked at him with the full weight of 43 undefeated challenges behind his eyes, and he held that look for exactly long enough to communicate that he was not unaware of what this conversation was actually about. The Thornwood produces all sorts of things, Selim said. It is a very old forest. Soren smiled. It was a genuine smile, which somehow made it worse. It is, he said. 300 years old in the most significant sense. Your ancestors did remarkable work there. A shame that all works have their limits. The room was very quiet. Soren's 7 first-tier guards stood very still in their practiced casual arrangement. Selim's 2 personal sentries at the door stood equally still, and were at an equally severe numerical disadvantage, and everyone present was aware of this and had arranged their faces accordingly. You will want to rest after your journey, Selim said. The north wing has been prepared. The north wing, which was on the opposite end of Ashenvale from the lower chambers. The north wing, from whose windows the lower chambers were entirely invisible. Soren held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he inclined his head, a gesture that was almost a bow and was specifically calibrated to fall just short of one. Generous as always, he said. Selim walked out of the south reception hall and through the corridors to the lower chambers, and he moved at an unhurried pace because hurrying would have told the stones in the walls that he was afraid. And the stones in the walls had long memories and loose associations with the wolves who walked past them daily. He found Drav outside the lower chamber door, speaking in a very low voice to the 4 wolves positioned there in plain clothes. He found Lyra inside the lower chamber, sitting on the edge of the stone bed with her hands in her lap, still dressed in the Thornwood-stained clothes she had been brought in wearing, looking at the wall with the expression of someone who was not looking at the wall at all, but at something the wall happened to be positioned in front of. She looked up when he entered. You moved me, she said. We have company, he said. Something shifted in her face. Not fear, but the immediate and practiced orientation of someone who has spent a long time living in the space between danger and the next necessary action. Who? She asked. Lord Soren of the Eastern Reach, Selim said. His family maintains an archive. He watched her absorb this. He watched her understand exactly what it meant without requiring additional explanation, and he noted, in the part of his mind that catalogued useful information, that she was not a person who needed things explained to her twice or slowly or with the sharp edges filed off. He knows what I am, she said. It was not a question. He knows what you might be, Selim said. Confirmation is what he came for. Lyra stood. She was not tall, and the low ceilings of the lower chamber suited her in a way the great hall had not. She had looked lost in the great hall, a small figure in an enormous space, though the darkness obeying her had rather solved that impression. Down here she looked contained, deliberate, like something that had chosen its dimensions carefully. "What does he want with me?" she asked. Selim looked at her for a moment. "The same thing everyone wants when they discover a power they do not control and cannot predict," he said. "To possess it, to direct it, to point it at something and pull a trigger." Lyra was quiet. The fire in the lower chamber's small grate burned steadily. It did not behave strangely near her. He noticed, not the way the torches in the great hall had. She was not doing anything to it. She was simply present in the room with it, and it burned the way fires burn when they are not being asked to be anything other than warm. "He will try to take me," she said. "He will try," Selim agreed. The distinction was deliberate. She heard it. Something in the set of her shoulders changed. A degree of bracing left them, not because she was relaxed, but because she had recognized the shape of an alliance being offered, which was different from and more complicated than relaxation. "You kept me safe," she said slowly, "from a man who came 3 hours early and arrived 1 hour after I did. A man whose outrider saw me at your gates." "Yes," Selim said. "Why?" she said, and it was not quite a question and not quite an accusation. It was the honest inquiry of someone who had learned, over a very long time, that being kept safe and being kept were often the same thing in different clothing. Selim held her gaze. He was honest because the situation had moved past the point where anything else was strategically useful, and also because he was discovering dishonesty in the specific gravitational field of this particular person felt like an action with consequences he could not fully anticipate. "Because whatever is coming through the Thornwood will not distinguish between you and me when it arrives," he said. "Because you are the only person in this territory who has encountered it before and survived. Because you came to me when you had no reason to trust me and every historical reason not to. And that required something I do not have a polished word for but that I recognize when I see it." He paused. "And because Soren wants you," he said, "which is reason enough on its own." Lyra looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled between them, honest and steady and warm. Outside the lower chamber's single narrow window, the sky was beginning, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to consider the possibility of morning. "The Thornwood at sunrise," she said. "You still want to go." "More than before," he said. "Now I understand what is coming toward it." She nodded slowly. It was not an agreement exactly. It was the acknowledgement of a shared trajectory. Two people who had arrived at this moment from opposite directions, moving now, however warily and however provisionally, in the same one. Outside, somewhere in the deep corridors of Ashenvale, a door opened and closed. The sound was careful. Too careful. The kind of careful that announces itself by trying not to. Both of them heard it. Both of them turned toward it in the same half-second. And in the corridor outside the lower chamber, in the flickering light of the passage torches, something moved past the door that was neither Drav nor any of the 4 plain-clothed wolves Selim had posted there. Something that smelled of the Eastern Reach. Something that had been in this corridor long enough to have come a very long way from the north wing. Lyra's hands dropped to her sides. The fire in the small grate dimmed. Not dramatically, not with the total extinction of the great hall torches, but with a quiet and deliberate reduction of something conserving itself for a purpose it had not yet revealed. Selim moved to the door. He put his hand against the wood and felt, through the stone and timber of Ashenvale, the particular vibration of a building that was about to become a different kind of place than the one it had been when the night began. He looked back at her. Her eyes were that color again, sky before lightning chooses where to land, and in the diminished firelight they were the brightest thing in the room. They were, in fact, the brightest thing in that entire wing of the castle. "Stay behind me," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely and specifically patient. "Selim," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. Just his name, without title, without distance. "I appreciate the instinct," she said. "But you may want to reconsider who you are asking to stand behind whom." The door opened. The thing in the corridor was not alone. Selim understood this the moment the door swung open and the cold came through it. Not the cold of a winter night, not the honest cold of stone and frost and seasons doing their ordinary work, but the other kind. The cold that has intention. The cold that moves toward warmth the way a predator moves toward sound. Not randomly, not as a consequence of physics, but with a specific and terrible focus of something that knows what it wants and has decided to have it. 3 of Soren's wolves stood in the passage. They were large. They were the kind of large that comes from years of selective pack breeding. All shoulders and jaw, and the particular blankness in the eyes of wolves who had learned to outsource their conscience to whoever was paying them. But they were not what made the cold. Behind them, at the far end of the corridor where the passage curved toward the lower stairwell, stood something that had been in the Thornwood. Selim could smell it from here. Pine resin and deep earth and the mineral absence of light. The scent of the Thornwood. But wrong in the way that a reflection in dark water is wrong, recognizable and reversed, and somehow more disturbing for the familiarity. It was not fully present. That was the only way he could describe it to himself in the half-second available for description. It occupied the space at the end of the corridor the way a shadow occupies space. It had dimension, it had weight, it displaced air and light, but looking directly at it required the eyes to do something they were not designed to do, to track something that existed slightly outside the spectrum of what vision was built to process. Lyra made a sound behind him. It was small. It was the smallest sound he had heard from her, smaller even than the silence where her scream should have been when he broke her wrist, because that silence had been the absence of something and this sound was the presence of something genuine and involuntary and deeply, structurally old. It was the sound of recognition. The sound of a wound remembering the instrument that made it. "It followed you," Selim said. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Soren's 3 wolves and the shape behind them, and he said it quietly, not as accusation, just as fact being named so it could be dealt with. "It has been following me since the Thornwood," she said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness cost her something. He could hear the price of it. "I thought I had enough distance. I thought coming here, to stone, to walls, to people, would dilute the trail. I was wrong. You should have told me," he said. "You should have broken fewer of my bones before I had the opportunity," she said. He could not argue with this. One of Soren's wolves stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was professional and apologetic in equal measure. The voice of a man carrying out instructions he had decided not to have opinions about. "Lord Soren requests the girl be transferred to Eastern Reach custody for her own protection," he said. "The Alpha King's hospitality is appreciated and no longer required." The shape at the end of the corridor moved. Did not walk. It redistributed. The way smoke redistributes when a door opens, flowing into available space through no mechanism that the eye could comfortably follow. It was closer now. The cold was significantly worse. Selim felt his wolf rise in his chest, not in aggression but in the older way, the deeper way, the way wolves respond to things that predate the concept of aggression, to things that exist in the part of the world that was old before wolves were young. His wolf rose and pressed against the inside of his ribs and then, with a specific discipline of 43 challenges and 20 years of absolute sovereignty, he held it there. Not suppressed. Held. Ready. "Tell Lord Soren," he said with perfect calm, with the absolute untroubled calm of a man who has decided that the next few minutes will require everything he is, that his request has been considered and declined. The wolves moved. What happened next happened very quickly and then very slowly, the way significant moments always arrange themselves in memory. The fast part being the physical collision of bodies in a narrow stone corridor, Selim meeting the first wolf with the contained and efficient violence of a man who knows exactly how much force each situation requires and applies precisely that and nothing more. The slow part being Lyra. He was aware of her behind him in the way he was aware of the walls on either side. As structural fact, as orientation, as something solid in a situation that was resolving rapidly toward chaos. He was not aware of the exact moment she stepped forward. He became aware of it the way you become aware of sunrise, not by seeing the sun, but by noticing that the quality of everything around you has changed. The cold in the corridor stopped, not retreated, up, as though something had placed a hand against its chest and said, with absolute authority, "Here and no further." The shape at the end of the corridor contracted. It pulled inward. Not frightened, Selim did not think it was capable of something as relationally complex as fear, but responsive, the way a fire responds to a sudden absence of oxygen, with a reflexive contraction of something that has encountered a limit it did not anticipate. Lyra walked past him. He was in the middle of managing two of Soren's wolves, one down, one still engaged, and she walked past him as though the corridor were empty, as though the wolves and the cold and the shape at the far end were details she was aware of and had decided to address in a specific order, and she was not yet at that detail. She was at the shape. She stopped 6 feet from it. The passage torches on either side of her burned upward, not flickering, not guttering, but standing straight and tall like soldiers being called to attention. She looked at the shape. He could not see her face from where he was. He could see her back, her shoulders, the dark tangle of her hair, and he could see the light, that pre-luminous depth, that suggestion of something vast, beginning to surface through her skin the way heat surfaces through stone on a summer afternoon. Not emergency, not explosion, patience. The terrible, absolute patience of something that has been waiting for precisely this moment and is now simply arriving at it. "I know what you are," she said to the shape. Her voice carried down the corridor the way certain sounds carry in stone spaces, completely without diminishment, finding every corner and returning changed by its own travel. "I know your name. I knew your name 300 years ago when 8 of us stood between you and what you were reaching for, and I know it now." The shape moved, a lateral redistribution, as though testing the boundaries of her presence, looking for an edge. "There is no edge," she said, as though she had heard the question the shape had not spoken. "There is only me. And I am not what I was 300 years ago." Something changed in the quality of the light. Selim had released the wolf he was holding. The wolf, displaying the survival instinct that distinguished the living from the otherwise, had chosen this moment to exercise discretion and flatten himself against the wall. Selim stood in the corridor and watched. He watched because there was nothing to defend against in this moment. There was only something to witness. Lyra raised her hands. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical sweep of stories told about power being wielded. She raised them the way you raise your hands to cup water from a stream, gently, with a gesture that acknowledges what you are receiving rather than demanding it. The light in the corridor expanded. It came from her the way sound comes from a bell, outward in all directions simultaneously, reaching every surface at once, and where it touched the stone walls of Ashenvale it revealed things that had always been there but that ordinary light was too shallow to find. Carvings. Ancient markings in a script that predated every language Selim had been educated in, cut into the stone by hands that must have known they were cutting a record for a future they would not live to see. The shapes were familiar. They were the same shapes that lived beneath Lyra's skin. The walls of Ashenvale had been waiting for her. The corridor filled with light the color of a sky 30 seconds before lightning. And then the lightning came. Not from above. From her. From the exact center of her chest. Not violent, not destructive, but clarifying, the way truth is clarifying, the way the moment of understanding is clarifying, the way the last piece of a very old and very complex thing finally finding its place is clarifying. Struck the shape. The shape did not scream. It unmade. Not destroyed, that was wrong, that was too simple and too clean for what Selim watched happen to the thing at the end of the corridor. It came apart the way a lie comes apart when every person who believed it simultaneously understands the truth. Not in pieces, not in violence, but in the sudden and total absence of the conditions that allowed it to exist in the first place. The cold went with it. The Thornwood smell went with it. What remained was just a corridor. Stone and torchlight and the smell of frost and the distant sound of the first birds beginning to make their dawn inquiries to a sky that was now, genuinely and irrevocably, deciding to become morning. Lyra lowered her hands. She stood very still. Selim walked toward her. He walked past the wolves who were pressing themselves against the walls with the expressions of men who had undergone profound and involuntary theological experiences, and he stopped beside her and looked at her face. She was pale. She was pale in the way that follows enormous effort, not sickness, the pallor of a body that has given something real, that has paid in the currency of the thing that matters most. Her eyes were closed. They stayed closed for long enough that something shifted in Selim's chest, something that moved with a sharpness that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with a specific and untranslatable fear of losing something before you have had time to understand its value. Then they opened. They were a different color. Not much. A degree. The way the sky is a degree lighter after the lightning passes than it was before, changed by the event, still itself but marked by what it has done. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted longer than moments are supposed to. "The Thornwood," she said finally. Her voice was rough in a way it had not been before. "It is over," he said. "I need to see it," she said. "I need to see the roots." He offered her his arm. Not as a concession. Not as a power gesture. As what it was. The simple human acknowledgement that she had just done something that had cost her considerably, and that the corridor to the courtyard was long, and that offers of steadiness were not insults when they were genuine. She looked at his arm. She looked at it for long enough that he understood she was deciding something that was not about the arm. She took it. They walked through Ashenvale together. Through the stone corridors with their newly revealed carvings, through the great hall where the torches burned straight and clean, through the heavy iron doors that opened onto the courtyard. The sky above them was the color of iron warming toward copper. The Thornwood, at the tree line beyond the courtyard walls, had changed. Even from here, even at this distance, Selim could see it. The density of the darkness was gone. The trees stood the way trees stand when they are only trees, tall and bare and wintered and ordinary, casting the honest shadows of ordinary things in ordinary early morning light. The lock was open. The thing it had been holding was gone. And what it had been holding the thing against was also gone. Lyra exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that carries the weight of a very specific duration, of time measured not in minutes or years but in the particular and personal unit of how long you have been waiting for something to be over. 300 years. In the courtyard, wolves were emerging. His wolves, drawn by the light and the sound and the change in the quality of the air, appearing at doorways and in archways and on the parapet above the gates with the expressions of people who have slept through something significant and woken to find that the world has rearranged itself into a configuration they were not briefed on. Drav appeared at Selim's left side. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the Thornwood. He looked at the claw marks on the corridor wall that were visible through the open hall doors, the physical record of the previous hour's events, left in stone by someone who would not be returning to explain them. "Soren," Selim said. "In the north wing," Drav said. He heard everything, I imagine, and is currently in the process of deciding whether this changes his calculation. Tell him, Selim said, that it does. What specifically should I tell him has changed? Drav asked. Selim looked at Lyra. She was looking at the Thornwood. The early light was on her face, copper and new and without the dark undertow of the previous hours, and she looked like what she was. Not a rogue wolf. Not a weapon. Not a secret buried under roots by frightened men who chose suppression over understanding. She looked like the last of something that should never have been made last. She looked like the beginning of what came next. Tell him, Selim said, that the thing his archive told him to fear no longer exists. Tell him that the girl his family spent 3 centuries trying to ensure would never be free is standing in my courtyard under my protection. Tell him that she walked into this territory when she had nowhere else to go and stood in my hall and endured things she should not have had to endure, and then turned around and saved every life behind these walls. Tell him that I am aware of his network inside my court and will be addressing it. And tell him that when she is ready, when she decides that she wants to, she will be welcomed here not as a ward, not as a weapon, not as a strategic asset, but as what she is. Drav waited. Which is, he said. Selim was quiet for a moment. Lyra turned from the Thornwood and looked at him. Her eyes in the morning light were the color of a sky 30 seconds after the lightning has passed. Cleared by it, changed by it, carrying the particular luminosity of atmosphere that has been charged and discharged and found that the event has left it more itself than it was before. Whatever she chooses to be, Selim said. He held her gaze. She held his. In the courtyard of Ashenvale, in the copper and iron light of a morning that had not been guaranteed the night before, the wolves of the northern reach stood and watched their alpha king look at a girl who had been buried 3 centuries ago and woken in time to save them, and they understood, without being told, the way wolves understand the things that matter most, that the world they were standing in was a different one than the world they had gone to sleep in. The Thornwood was just trees. The cold had gone. And the last celestial wolf was standing in the light with her hands at her sides, and her face turned toward a king who had knelt for her in the mud of his own hall. And neither of them was looking away. Drav took his leave without being dismissed, which was the mark of an exceptional beta, and also a man who understood a threshold moment when he was standing on one. The wolves on the parapet found reasons to attend to other things. The courtyard became, by degrees, theirs. You did not have to do that, Lyra said. The speech, she clarified when he tilted his head. To Drav. For Soren. It was not a speech, Selim said. It was a statement of position. Your position, she said. Our position, he said. The word landed between them with a quiet weight of something that had not been there before and was now present in the world. Real and irrevocable, and carrying all the complications of its own existence. She did not argue with it. She did not agree with it out loud. She looked at the Thornwood for a long time, and he stood beside her and let her look, because some things require witness time, because the act of watching something you survived is its own and necessary form of processing, and because he had nowhere else to be. 8 of them, she said quietly. 8 of us went into those roots and did not come out. I know, he said. My bloodline was responsible for that. Your bloodline's fear was responsible for that, she said. The distinction matters to me. I need you to understand that it matters to me. He was quiet. He let the distinction matter. He let it stand as what it was. Not an absolution, not an erasure of history, but an act of precise accounting by a person who understood that the stories we tell about what happened determine what becomes possible afterward. What do you want? He asked her. She looked at him. Right now, she said. To start with, he said. Something to eat, she said without hesitation. Something that is not roots. Something moved in his chest. It was not quite a laugh. It was the structural precursor to one. The internal shift that precedes laughter, that tells the body it is in the presence of something it wants to be near. And after that, he said. She looked back at the Thornwood. The morning light was fully committed now. Gold moving into copper, moving into the clean white light of a winter day that had decided to be clear. The trees stood bare and ordinary and free. I want to know, she said, what I was in the middle of becoming. Before your ancestors decided to interrupt me. I want to know what the second convergence actually is. Not what your archive says it is, not what Soren's archive says it is. What it actually is. He paused. I want to know if I am still becoming it, she said. Or if last night was the end. Selim looked at the Thornwood. He thought about the carvings in the corridor walls, the script that matched the light beneath her skin, the record left by hands that knew they were writing for a future reader. He thought about what the archive had not said, about the sections that were missing, not damaged, he understood now, not lost to time, but deliberately removed, leaving gaps that were shaped exactly like information someone had not wanted a future king to have. He thought about the girl beside him, 300 years in the dark roots of a forest, and she had woken and walked out and crossed the Thornwood border and endured his hall and stood in his corridor and unmade the thing that nothing else could have unmade. And she was asking him what she was still becoming. She was asking him because she did not know. Because the knowledge of what she was had been buried with her. Had been part of what they had tried to prevent by pressing her into the earth. She had the power and not the map. He had the map, or the ghost of one, the outline of a map in the shapes of the missing sections, and not the power. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then we find out together, he said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a political statement. It was something older than either of those things and more durable. It was the specific and binding promise of two people who have survived the same night from different positions and recognized, in the morning after it, that what they are separately is less than what the moment requires, and that going forward alone, when going forward together is possible, would be a waste of something the world spent a very long time arranging. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she nodded. Once. The way mountains nod, with the whole weight of what they are, with a full investment of mass and time and the particular dignity of things that have endured. They walked back into Ashenvale together. Through the iron doors, through the great hall, through the corridors with their ancient revealed script, past the wolves who made way for them with the instinctive deference of people in the presence of something they do not yet have words for but understand in the oldest part of themselves. Behind them, the Thornwood stood in the morning light. Just trees. Just an old forest on the edge of an old territory, bare-branched and winter-honest and free. Free in the way that things are free when what was holding them is gone, when the lock has been opened from the inside by the only person who knew where the lock was, because she had put it there herself 3 centuries ago, with the last breath she took before the roots closed over her. She had not been buried. She had been waiting. And she had waited, patient as glaciers, quiet as the space between stars, until the world was ready for what she was about to become. The Thornwood stood in the light and said nothing, the way forests say nothing, the way all the oldest things say nothing. Not because they have no story to tell, but because their silence is the story, and you have to be still enough and old enough and brave enough to hear it. And long after the morning had become afternoon and the afternoon had become the kind of evening that feels like the first evening of a different world, the wolves of the northern reach would speak of what they had witnessed. In low voices, around fires, in the particular and reverent tone reserved for things that do not fit inside ordinary language. Of the girl who had been buried in the dark and come back carrying the dark inside her like a lantern. Of the king who had knelt in the mud of his own hall and risen to stand beside her. And of the morning when the Thornwood released its last secret to a sky that was finally ready to hold it. They would say that she had saved them. They would say that he had chosen her. And the truest ones, the ones who had been there, who had stood in the corridor and the courtyard and felt the cold lift and seen the light expand, would say something more precise and more lasting than any of that. They would say that two broken and extraordinary things had found, in the same impossible night, that what they were missing was not strength, and not power, and not history, and not the absence of pain. They would say that what they were missing was simply, and at last, each other. And they would say it quietly, the way you say the truest things. As though the weight of them might, if spoken too loudly, collapse the fragile and magnificent architecture of the world they have made possible. As though some gifts are only real when held gently. As though she lowered the stars so that he might finally, after all his years of raising his crown to an empty sky, understand what he had been reaching for.